the millionaire reached out to a boy, but never imagined he was his lost son. Nicholas Whitmore was a 48-year-old man whose life had always been marked by financial success. The city of Velmor, known for its towering buildings and fast-paced rhythm, saw him as a symbol of power and influence. He owned one of the largest tech companies in the region, but despite all the prestige, his personal life was somewhat empty. Social events, glamorous parties, and business meetings left little room for deeper reflections. Nicholas's apartment was located in the heart of Velmor, in one of the city's most luxurious buildings. With a privileged view of the glittering skyline, he spent many nights looking at the city lights, wondering if that was all life had to offer. Although he had everything money could buy, the recent loss of his mother had left him with an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. His mother, Eleanor Whitmore, was well known in Velmor, but for a very different reason. She had dedicated much of her life to charity work, especially in Rosewood Heights, a neighborhood in Velmor where inequalities were more visible. Eleanor had a unique way of connecting with people, helping those most in need, even when her own health began to decline. Nicholas never understood why his mother spent so much time away from high society circles, preferring volunteer work in a neighborhood he always considered problematic. To him, generous donations were enough, but Eleanor saw things differently. She believed that real change came from direct contact, from looking into people's eyes and hearing their stories. When Eleanor passed away, Nicholas received a letter she had left, where she expressed her wish that he not only continue his financial contributions but also visit Rosewood Heights. The letter was simple, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Nicholas, I know you always thought I spent too much time away from our comfortable life. But there is something in Rosewood Heights that I would like you to see with your own eyes. It's not about what money can do for them, but about what they can do for you. Go there and discover what I found, even if only once." Initially, Nicholas ignored the request, too busy with business and the responsibilities that came with his empire. But in the weeks following the funeral, he found himself increasingly drawn to those words, as if a part of his mother was still calling out to him. Finally, on a cloudy autumn afternoon, he decided to drive to Rosewood Heights. As his luxury car moved through increasingly narrow and dimly lit streets, he noticed the drastic change in the scenery. The building facades became simpler, and smiles from people rarer. But there was something in the atmosphere of that place that made him slow down and observe more closely. Nicholas parked his car in front of a small children's shelter, which, according to his records, was one of the places his mother visited most. He stayed there for a few minutes, staring at the worn-out facade of the building and the children playing in the yard, laughing despite the modest conditions. His mother's name was inscribed on a plaque near the entrance, in honor of her contributions. The sight made him realize that despite all his power and resources, he barely knew that part of the city and the impact his mother had left there. A sense of nostalgia and a hint of regret began to fill his chest. He felt that perhaps he was finally understanding a bit of what his mother wanted him to see. At that moment, he decided to step inside the shelter and learn more about the work his mother had done. It was then, upon crossing the entrance, that he met Daniel, a young volunteer who cared for the children with an enthusiasm Nicholas hadn't seen in someone for a long time. As Daniel led an activity with the kids, Nicholas watched from a distance, trying to understand what kept him there, dedicated to something that, in Nicholas's eyes, seemed so far removed from his reality. And there, amidst an environment so different from his luxurious routine, Nicholas began to wonder if there was something beyond the numbers and profits that he should be seeking. The first seed of a transformation had been planted, and he had no idea that this encounter with Daniel would be the beginning of a journey that would forever change his view of himself and his own past. Nicholas, as he crossed the worn doors of the children's shelter, was greeted by an environment that contrasted sharply with the opulence of his routine. The walls were simple, decorated with colorful children's drawings and some old posters of community events. The place had a faint smell of coffee and aged books, a scent that evoked a sense of warmth despite its modest appearance. As he walked down the hallways, he heard laughter coming from a nearby room. Peeking through the slightly open door, he saw Daniel surrounded by children who were eagerly participating in a reading session. Daniel had a warm smile, and the kids seemed to adore him, interrupting the reading with curious questions. He patiently answered each one, exuding an energy that captivated everyone around. Nicholas watched in silence, wondering what kept someone so young and full of life dedicating his time there, instead of pursuing a more promising career in a city that offered so many opportunities. After a few minutes, one of the children noticed Nicholas's presence and pointed in his direction. "Hey, there's someone there," said a little girl, making Daniel turn and meet Nicholas's gaze. Daniel smiled warmly and stood up, bidding a quick farewell to the children before walking toward the stranger who had been watching them. "Hello, can I help you?" Daniel said, extending his hand to Nicholas, who shook it hesitantly. I'm Nicholas Whitmore," he replied, as if his name alone might be enough to explain his presence there. "My mother used to help out at this place. I wanted to see what she was doing." Daniel observed him for a moment, recognizing the famous last name, but without showing the reverence Nicholas was used to seeing when he mentioned it. Instead, Daniel gave a genuine smile, as if he were speaking to an ordinary person. "Oh yes, Mrs. Eleanor was amazing. She came here often, organized events for the kids, and most importantly, spent time with each of us. I think she believed that a smile and a little attention could change someone's life. And, you know, she was right," Daniel said, his gaze drifting momentarily into the memories he shared with Nicholas's mother. Nicholas felt a pang in his chest upon hearing this. It was as if, even after her death, Eleanor was trying to teach him one last lesson. He forced a smile and continued the conversation, curious about this young man who spoke of his mother with such admiration. "And you, Daniel, why are you here? It seems like you could be anywhere else, in a better position," Nicholas asked, trying to keep his tone casual but unable to hide the curiosity in his voice. Daniel shrugged and looked at the kids still playing in the room next door. "I grew up here in this neighborhood. I know every corner and every person who lives here. Rosewood Heights might not be perfect, but it's my home. And when I was younger, your mother was one of the few people who truly believed in me. When everyone said I had no future, she gave me books, encouraged me to study, even got me a scholarship to finish school. Now, I try to do the same for the kids here," he explained, his voice carrying a sincerity that Nicholas hadn't expected. As Daniel spoke, Nicholas found himself thinking about all the times Eleanor had mentioned the human potential she saw in places like this. To him, it always sounded too idealistic, a romanticized vision of his mother. But listening to Daniel, he began to realize that there might have been a truth there that he had never tried to understand. The two spent a good amount of time talking at the shelter. Daniel showed Nicholas some old photos of events Eleanor had organized, and they shared stories about the impact she had on the community. Daniel seemed to have a special fondness for Eleanor, but he also spoke with a certain sadness in his eyes, as if there was more than just gratitude in his relationship with the Whitmore matriarch. Before parting ways, Daniel invited Nicholas to return to the shelter whenever he wanted. "I know life here in Rosewood Heights is very different from what you're used to, but I think your mother would want you to see this up close," Daniel said with an encouraging smile. Nicholas nodded, keeping those words in the back of his mind. He didn't yet know why he felt the urge to return, but something in Daniel's manner, in the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke about those kids and Eleanor, made him feel that there was something he needed to discover here. Something that might be more important than any business deal in his life. As Nicholas got into his car to return to downtown Velmor, the sky was beginning to take on shades of orange with the sunset. He drove in silence, reflecting on the unexpected encounter and the memories the day had stirred. For the first time in a long while, Nicholas felt like he was following an unknown path, and somehow, that intrigued him. Nicholas watched in silence, wondering what kept someone so young and full of life dedicating his time there, instead of pursuing a more promising career in a city that offered so many opportunities. After a few minutes, One of the children noticed Nicholas's presence and pointed in his direction. "Hey, there's someone there," said a little girl, making Daniel turn and meet Nicholas's gaze. Daniel smiled warmly and stood up, bidding a quick farewell to the children before walking toward the stranger who had been watching them. "Hello, can I help you?" Daniel said, extending his hand to Nicholas, who shook it hesitantly. I'm Nicholas Whitmore," he replied, as if his name alone might be enough to explain his presence there. "My mother used to help out at this place. I wanted to see what she was doing." Daniel observed him for a moment, recognizing the famous last name, but without showing the reverence Nicholas was used to seeing when he mentioned it. Instead, Daniel gave a genuine smile, as if he were speaking to an ordinary person. "Oh yes, Mrs. Eleanor was amazing. She came here often, organized events for the kids, and most importantly, spent time with each of us. I think she believed that a smile and a little attention could change someone's life. And, she was right," Daniel said, his gaze drifting momentarily into the memories he shared with Nicholas's mother. Nicholas felt a pang in his chest upon hearing this. It was as if, even after her death, Eleanor was trying to teach him one last lesson. He forced a smile and continued the conversation, curious about this young man who spoke of his mother with such admiration. "And you, Daniel, why are you here? It seems like you could be anywhere else, in a better position," Nicholas asked, trying to keep his tone casual but unable to hide the curiosity in his voice. Daniel shrugged and looked at the kids still playing in the room next door. "I grew up here in this neighborhood. I know every corner and every person who lives here. Rosewood Heights might not be perfect, but it's my home. And when I was younger, your mother was one of the few people who truly believed in me. When everyone said I had no future, she gave me books, encouraged me to study, even got me a scholarship to finish school. Now, I try to do the same for the kids here," he explained, his voice carrying a sincerity that Nicholas hadn't expected. As Daniel spoke, Nicholas found himself thinking about all the times Eleanor had mentioned the human potential she saw in places like this. To him, it always sounded too idealistic, a romanticized vision of his mother. But listening to Daniel, he began to realize that there might have been a truth there that he had never tried to understand. The two spent a good amount of time talking at the shelter. Daniel showed Nicholas some old photos of events Eleanor had organized, and they shared stories about the impact she had on the community. Daniel seemed to have a special fondness for Eleanor, but he also spoke with a certain sadness in his eyes, as if there was more than just gratitude in his relationship with the Whitmore matriarch. Before parting ways, Daniel invited Nicholas to return to the shelter whenever he wanted. "I know life here in Rosewood Heights is very different from what you're used to, but I think your mother would want you to see this up close," Daniel said with an encouraging smile. Nicholas nodded, keeping those words in the back of his mind. He didn't yet know why he felt the urge to return, but something in Daniel's manner, in the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke about those kids and Eleanor, made him feel that there was something he needed to discover here. Something that might be more important than any business deal in his life. As Nicholas got into his car to return to downtown Velmor, the sky was beginning to take on shades of orange with the sunset. He drove in silence, reflecting on the unexpected encounter and the memories the day had stirred. For the first time in a long while, Nicholas felt like he was following an unknown path, and somehow, that intrigued him. As Nicholas walked through the streets of Rosewood Heights, feeling the cold wind cut across his face, he realized he was at the beginning of a journey far more personal than he had imagined. What had started as an attempt to reconnect with his mother's legacy was now turning into a search for a past he never knew existed. He stopped in front of an old park bench and sat down, looking at the dry leaves falling around him. That night, he decided he needed to uncover the full truth about Helena, Daniel, and the role his mother had played in their lives. He knew he couldn't just ignore the clues and move on. He needed to confront the possibility that, behind his mother's generosity, there was a hidden secret, a truth that could forever change the relationship between him and Daniel. With the photo of Helena and the baby tucked into his pocket, Nicholas looked up at the starry sky over Rosewood Heights, feeling the weight of a decision that could change everything. From that moment on, his life became increasingly intertwined with Daniel's, and he was determined to find answers, even if it meant facing a past he had preferred to leave buried. The days following the discovery of the photo were filled with restlessness for Nicholas. The suspicion that Daniel could be his son consumed him, but he knew he couldn't act hastily. He needed concrete evidence, something to confirm his suspicions before confronting the young man with such a devastating truth. Nicholas spent sleepless nights, replaying in his mind the moments he had shared with Helena in the past. He remembered how she smiled at him, the deep conversations about the future, and the dreams they had briefly shared. He wondered what might have happened for Helena never to mention the pregnancy. Could it be that she had decided to move on alone, never telling him? Or perhaps she herself wasn't sure. He decided he needed more information, and the only person who might provide some answers was an old friend of Helena's, a woman named Clara. She and Helena had been close, and Nicholas remembered seeing them together at a few events organized by Eleanor. The connection between Clara and Helena wasn't just friendship, but a kind of sisterhood that surpassed the hardships of life in Rosewood Heights. Nicholas found her working at a small flower shop near the neighborhood, a simple yet welcoming place. As he entered the shop, the gentle chime of bells above the door announced his arrival. Clara, a woman in her mid-50s, looked up from the counter where she was arranging a bouquet, and her face lit up with a smile when she recognized Nicholas. "Mr. Whitmore, what a surprise! I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said, adjusting her apron as she wiped her hands. "Claire, please, call me Nicholas," he replied, trying to muster a friendly smile. I wanted to talk to you about Helena. I have some questions, if you don't mind." Clara's expression changed, a mix of curiosity and nostalgia crossing her face. She gestured toward a table at the back of the shop, where the two could talk without being disturbed. Nicholas felt his heart tighten as he sat down, bracing himself to confront memories he had preferred to keep distant. "Helena was a special woman, always was," Clara began, looking at the bouquet of daisies in her hands. "She had a strength that few people knew about. It wasn't easy for her, raising a child on her own, but she never complained. And, of course, your mother's help was essential." Nicholas swallowed hard upon hearing his mother's name again. He placed the photo he had found on the table, showing Helena with the baby in her arms next to Eleanor. Clara looked at the image for a moment, a sad smile appearing on her lips. That photo, it was taken just after Daniel was born. He was so tiny, and Helena was so proud, Clara sighed, her voice trembling with emotion. "She never told me who the father was, you know? I asked sometimes, but she always changed the subject. She said it didn't matter, that she would be enough to care for Daniel." "And you never suspected who it might be?" Nicholas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Clara hesitated before answering, as if weighing her words. "I had my suspicions. She mentioned once that she had been involved with someone from outside the neighborhood, a man who seemed to understand her ambitions. But after he left, she never brought it up again. It seemed like she had decided to move on, no matter how much it hurt." "And your mother?" Clara paused, looking directly at Nicholas. "Your mother knew, didn't she? She helped Helena as if she were protecting a secret." Clara's words echoed in Nicholas's mind, like pieces of a puzzle starting to fit together. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of guilt and surprise. Could it be that his mother knew Daniel was his son and had kept that secret all along? "Clara, do you know why my mother helped Helena so much? They were friends, but their closeness, it seems like there was something more," said Nicholas, trying to keep the urgency out of his voice. Clara bit her lip, thoughtful, before responding. "I think your mother saw in Helena someone who needed support, someone facing the world alone. But it also seemed like there was a sense of relief in the way she talked about Helena and Daniel, as if she was fulfilling a promise. I never quite understood it, but I always felt like there was something unspoken between them." Nicholas felt the weight of Clara's words and realized he was closer to a revelation that would change his life. He thanked her for the conversation and said his goodbyes, leaving the flower shop with his heart racing and his mind swirling with thoughts. He walked through the streets of Rosewood Heights, trying to understand how his mother had become so deeply involved in Helena's life and what she might have promised that woman he had loved for a brief moment. When he returned to his apartment that night, Nicholas sat by the window, watching the lights of Velmor twinkle in the distance. The city seemed indifferent to his anguish, to the doubts that now plagued him. He knew he needed to find a document that would prove Daniel's paternity, a definitive clue that would confirm his suspicions. But the thought that his mother might have kept such a huge secret all these years left him unsettled, as if the solid ground beneath his feet was crumbling. That night, holding the photo of Helena and the baby, Nicholas made a silent promise. If Daniel was truly his son, he would do whatever it took to protect him and ensure that he knew the truth, even if that truth was painful for them both. And as the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate Rosewood Heights, he decided that his quest for answers was only beginning. After his conversation with Clara, Nicholas delved even deeper into his search for answers. He felt as if he was exploring uncharted territory, stepping into memories that had long been buried. Helena's constant presence in his thoughts was a reminder that more was at stake than mere curiosity. It was a journey to understand a past that now seemed irrevocably intertwined with his present. Nicholas decided to visit the law office that handled his mother's old files, hoping to find some document that could clarify Eleanor's reasons for helping Helena. The place was somber, with shelves full of old folders and the familiar aroma of paper and aged leather. The lawyer, a middle-aged man who had known the Whitmore family for years, greeted him with a respectful yet curious demeanor. "Mr. Whitmore, how can I assist you?" the lawyer asked, closing a folder he had in his hands and leaning back in his chair. "I need access to some of my mother's personal documents, especially anything related to financial support she provided to a woman named Helena." "It's important and personal," Nicholas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The lawyer nodded slowly, studying Nicholas's face for a moment before standing up and heading to a metal cabinet at the back of the room. "I'll see what I can find, but I must inform you that some of these documents are confidential, kept in accordance with your mother's wishes. If there is anything she decided to keep private, I might not be able to share it without a court order." Nicholas felt a chill run down his spine. The thought that his own mother might have hidden something so significant from him made him uneasy, but he tried not to show it. As the lawyer searched through the files, Nicholas glanced around, trying to control his anxiety. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like hours, the lawyer returned with a box of old documents. He placed the box on the table with a careful gesture and lifted the lid, revealing a collection of letters and old receipts. "Here are some records of donations your mother made over the years, including some transfers to Helena. And look at this, there's a letter written by your mother, addressed to her. It seems your mother made sure this document was kept among the more private files," the lawyer remarked, handing the letter to Nicholas. Nicholas held the envelope in his hands, feeling the rough texture of the old paper. Helena's name was written by hand, in elegant cursive. He opened the letter carefully, reading his mother's words for the first time since he had begun his search. "Underscore Helena, I hope this help provides you with the support you need to raise your child with dignity and safety. I know you are capable of facing any challenge, and I will always be willing to help in whatever is needed. I know there are things left unsaid, and some truths may be difficult to bear. But, somehow, I hope that one day everything will unfold as it should." Nicholas felt his heart race as he finished reading. Eleanor's message was ambiguous but carried an emotional weight he never expected from his mother. The words suggested that Eleanor knew more than she had let on all those years. He wondered what exactly she had meant by "revealed as it should be." With the letter in hand, Nicholas left the law office, feeling that he was closer to a major revelation, but still missing key pieces of the puzzle. As he walked through the streets of Velmor, the city seemed shrouded in a fog of uncertainty, reflecting his state of mind. The tall buildings, the lights beginning to flicker on as evening fell, everything around him seemed to suggest that the truth was near, but that he still had to dig deeper. He decided that his next step would be to find a medical record or birth certificate that confirmed the exact date of Daniel's birth. If the date aligned with the period when he and Helena were together, his suspicions would gain more weight. So, he went to the local hospital where Daniel was born, knowing that accessing such old records might be challenging. At the hospital, he was greeted by a helpful staff member who showed resistance to releasing information without formal authorization. Nicholas then took a more personal approach, explaining that his search was driven by an old connection with Helena and a desire to better understand his past. The staff member, touched by the sincerity in his voice, glanced around before leaning slightly toward him and whispering, "I can't give you an official copy, sir, but if I find something in the records, I might leave the document on the desk for a few minutes while I take a break. What you do during that time is up to you." Nicholas thanked her, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. He waited patiently as the staff member searched through physical files in the archives, hoping that the information he needed was there. Finally, she returned, leaving a folder on the desk before stepping out of the room. Nicholas opened the folder, finding Daniel's birth certificate. The date was there, in bold, and beside it, the name of the mother, Helena. He leaned over the document, his heart racing as he saw the exact birth date, 8 months after the time he and Helena had been together. The confirmation was both devastating and illuminating. Nicholas felt his legs grow weak, and he had to lean on the desk to steady himself. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Daniel was his son, and all these years, he had been a stranger to his own blood. He left the hospital with the document still fresh in his mind, knowing there was no way to escape the truth any longer. But how would he reveal it to Daniel? How could he explain that Daniel's mother, Helena, had kept this secret until the end? And above all, how would he cope with the guilt that began to settle in his heart for not being present in his own son's life? As night fell over Velmor and the streets of Rosewood Heights lit up under the streetlights, Nicholas walked with uncertain steps. Each corner seemed to bring a new memory of Helena, of how their lives could have been different if he had known from the start. And now, with the truth in his hands, he knew he would need courage to face it. But at the same time, he felt he could no longer turn back. The promise he had made to himself, to protect Daniel and ensure he knew the truth, was what drove him to keep going even in the face of the pain and uncertainty of what lay ahead. Nicholas returned to his mansion in Rosewood Heights, but that night, the luxurious walls and the view of the illuminated city felt suffocating. Sitting in his library, surrounded by books that told stories of courage and redemption, he felt that his own narrative had taken a turn he could never have imagined. The discovery that Daniel was his son was a truth that changed everything. And even more difficult than accepting this reality was the task of deciding how and when to share it. Nicholas's thoughts were turbulent, but one feeling stood out: guilt. He thought of all the years he had missed in Daniel's life, how he could have been there during the young man's childhood and teenage years. Now, the image of Helena constantly came to his mind, with her mysterious smile and eyes that held secrets he had never had the courage to fully uncover. In an attempt to calm his mind, he took out a bottle of aged whiskey he kept for special occasions and poured himself a generous glass. He walked to the window of his library, from where he could see the lights of Velmor stretching out like a glittering carpet. Outside, the world went on, unaware of the emotional turmoil he faced. But for Nicholas, nothing felt the same. "How am I going to face you now, Daniel?" he murmured, his voice low, blending with the silence of the night. Doubt gnawed at him. Telling Daniel the truth would mean confronting decades of lies, the absence, and the secrets that Helena had kept until the end. Would Daniel be able to forgive him for a past he never even knew existed? And could Nicholas forgive himself? As the alcohol burned his throat, a decision began to form in his mind. He knew he couldn't carry this secret alone for much longer. Daniel deserved to know the truth, even if it meant shattering the image he had of his own life. But how to approach him? How to bring up such a devastating revelation? The next morning, Nicholas woke up early, still restless. He went to his office, surrounded by documents and records that once seemed so important but now felt like distractions compared to what truly mattered. He needed a strategy to get closer to Daniel without raising suspicions, to earn his trust before revealing what he had discovered. As he weighed his options, an idea took shape. He decided to invite Daniel to lunch, using his interest in the social projects Daniel managed as a pretext. This way, he could get to know the young man better, see beyond what the reports and photos showed. Nicholas needed to be sure that Daniel was ready to hear what he had to say. The phone call was harder than he had expected. Each ring seemed to echo his anxiety until Daniel finally answered. His voice was polite but slightly distant, like someone still getting used to the sudden attention from the millionaire who had supported his project. "Daniel, this is Nicholas Whitmore. I'd like to invite you to lunch tomorrow. I've been thinking about the projects you're developing for the Rosewood Heights community, and I think it would be interesting for us to discuss them further." Nicholas tried to keep a casual tone, but the anxiety seeped through his words. On the other end of the line, Daniel hesitated for a moment. He hadn't expected their encounter to become more than a simple thank you for the donation. But at the same time, he saw the opportunity to expand the reach of his project and gain more support. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you for the invitation. We can meet tomorrow at noon at the restaurant near the Central Library. I think it's a good place to discuss ideas," Daniel replied, his tone more enthusiastic as he tried to hide his surprise. "Perfect. See you then," Nicholas replied before hanging up, taking a deep breath as a weight lifted off his shoulders, if only for a moment. The next day, the chosen restaurant was sophisticated yet discreet, a place where business meetings and casual encounters happened without much distraction. Nicholas arrived first, sitting at the reserved table and watching the entrance. When he saw Daniel arriving, he couldn't help but notice the subtle resemblance between them. The way he walked, the way he observed his surroundings, everything seemed more familiar than Nicholas wanted to admit. Daniel greeted Nicholas with a firm handshake, but his eyes showed a hint of curiosity. He didn't understand why a man like Nicholas Whitmore, with so many business interests and a life so different from his own, wanted to know him better. But he decided to set his curiosity aside and make the most of the opportunity. During lunch, Nicholas asked questions about Daniel's social projects, trying to learn every detail of his work and life. He listened intently, absorbing each word, each expression from the young man in front of him. And the more he listened, the more he felt a connection to him, the more he saw a reflection of himself in Daniel, as if each detail was a confirmation of what he already knew deep down. Daniel, in turn, began to lower his guard. Nicholas seemed different from what he had imagined, less distant, more interested in his work than in mere formality. At times, he even found himself laughing at Nicholas's casual comments, something he never thought he'd do with a man of his stature. But deep down, Nicholas knew that this wasn't the moment to reveal the truth. He wanted to build a bridge of trust first, to see if Daniel was ready to handle something that could change his life forever. And as he watched Daniel speak passionately about the young people he helped in Rosewood Heights, he felt a pang of pride, a pride that, for years, he didn't know he could have. When lunch ended, Nicholas said goodbye to Daniel with a handshake, promising to continue supporting the projects and suggesting another meeting in a few days. As he watched the young man walk away along the bustling sidewalk of Velmor, Nicholas knew that time was running out. He would need to find the right words for the moment when the truth came to light, but for now, he felt that he had taken an important first step. He returned to his mansion that afternoon with a mix of anxiety and hope. For the first time, he felt that he might be able to reconnect with a past that had always haunted him. And as night fell over the city, Nicholas looked up at the stars that began to appear in the Velmor sky, promising himself that he would find a way to mend the mistakes that time and silence had created. The days following the first lunch between Nicholas and Daniel were marked by occasional meetings, where conversations flowed with a surprising ease for both. Nicholas, who had always considered himself a reserved man, found a strange relief in sharing moments with Daniel, even though he carefully kept the true reason for his approach hidden. One Saturday, Nicholas suggested a visit to the places where Daniel coordinated community activities, an invitation that excited the young man. For him, it was a chance to show the impact his work was having, while Nicholas sought to see Daniel in his most natural environment, away from the formalities of restaurants and business meetings. When they arrived at one of the community centers in Rosewood Heights, Nicholas watched Daniel interact with the children and young people who frequented the place. The genuine joy in Daniel's eyes, the care with every detail, and the way he cared about those he helped stirred a mix of admiration and a melancholy in Nicholas that he couldn't quite explain. "You really make a difference here, Daniel. It's inspiring to see how people trust you," Nicholas commented as they walked through the courtyard of the community center. The place was simple, but there was an atmosphere of hope, a space where dreams could grow. Daniel looked at Nicholas and smiled, clearly touched by the compliment. For him, those words came from a man who held prestige and power, and who had chosen to take the time to understand what he did. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I think we all need a purpose, something to fight for. For me, helping these people is what gives meaning to everything," Daniel replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I grew up watching my mother fight to give her best for me, and I think it's my way of honoring what she did for us." Hearing Daniel mention his mother, Nicholas felt a dull ache in his chest. He thought of Helena, the woman he had known so many years ago, who had kept such a profound secret. The connection between past and present seemed clearer with every word from Daniel, and Nicholas had to make an effort to keep a calm expression while they talked. During the visits to the projects, Nicholas noticed something that made him reflect even more on his role in Daniel's life. As Daniel shared stories of the young people he had helped rebuild their lives, he mentioned how he missed having a father figure, someone to guide him through the tough choices of adolescence. "Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to have a father around. Not that I'm not grateful to my mother, far from it, but I think we all feel like something's missing, right?" Daniel said, with a smile that tried to hide his vulnerability. Nicholas felt a lump in his throat hearing those words. The truth was becoming harder to hide, and Nicholas knew that the days he spent with Daniel were a blessing but also a torment. He watched the young man connect with others with the same dedication that Helena had when she created a welcoming space for him, and he saw in Daniel the shadows of a past he had failed to appreciate. Each of Daniel's smiles, each kind gesture, seemed to remind him of everything he had missed. As they walked back to the car, Daniel thanked Nicholas for the visit, and Nicholas felt an impulse he couldn't contain. He paused for a moment and turned to Daniel, with an expression the young man couldn't quite read. "Daniel, have you ever thought that maybe some answers about your past are closer than you think?" Nicholas asked, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. The young man frowned, clearly confused by the change in tone. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Whitmore?" Daniel asked, with an uneasy smile, as if trying to ease the tension that had suddenly appeared between them. Nicholas shook his head, smiling slightly, trying to dispel the seriousness that had taken over the conversation. He knew it still wasn't time to reveal everything, but the weight of the truth was becoming unbearable. "Nothing, just a thought. I think we all have stories we don't know about, and maybe it's worth discovering some of them. Who knows?" Nicholas tried to sound casual, but Daniel's attentive look suggested he wasn't convinced. After dropping him off at home, Nicholas drove through the city of Velmor, passing by places that had never caught his attention before. Now, every corner seemed to carry meaning, as if he were trying to see the city through Daniel's eyes, absorbing the life he had built without the presence of the father he never knew. Doubt gnawed at his mind. Revealing the truth could bring them closer or tear them apart. What he had was an emotional puzzle, where every piece seemed to fit perfectly, but could just as easily crumble with a single misplaced word. And while Nicholas faced his internal dilemmas, Daniel, in his modest home, pondered Nicholas's strange behavior. Why would a man so powerful and distant from his reality be so interested in his life? The question began to linger in his thoughts, but he pushed it aside, choosing to focus on the projects and the people who depended on him. Unbeknownst to him, both were drawing closer to a truth that would change their lives forever. And at the same time, each step Nicholas took toward Daniel seemed like a move toward the inevitable, a revelation that could heal old wounds or create new ones even deeper. After the meeting at the community center, Nicholas couldn't get Daniel's words out of his mind. The mention of missing a father figure, the similarities between the young man and Helena, and his own desire to understand more about that lost past led him down a path of uncertainty. He knew he could no longer ignore the questions that haunted him. On a rainy afternoon, as the sky over Velmor was shrouded in dark clouds, Nicholas sat in his office, surrounded by piles of papers and documents he had requested from his investigators. Old photos, medical records, and a series of documents that dated back to the time he and Helena had been together. It was then that he found a photo of Helena, smiling in front of a hospital in Rosewood Heights. Nicholas stared at it for a long time, his trembling fingers holding the image worn by time. In the background, a sign was visible, Rosewood Maternity. The date on the back of the photo matched the abrupt end of his relationship with Helena. It can't be a coincidence, Nicholas murmured to himself, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. He reviewed the papers again, and his attention was drawn to a birth record of a boy, with no father's name, only Helena listed as the responsible party. The date, the circumstances, and the physical similarities between him and Daniel were too clear to ignore. The impact of this discovery made him lean back in his leather chair, running his hands over his face in a gesture of exhaustion and disbelief. Nicholas felt as though the air had been knocked out of his lungs. If his suspicions were correct, Daniel was his son, the son he never knew existed. The revelation was overwhelming, bringing a whirlwind of emotions, regret, guilt, and above all, fear of how this truth might affect Daniel. The following days were a torment. Nicholas watched Daniel's activities from a distance, as the young man continued working on his community projects, unaware of the emotional storm raging in Nicholas's mind. He wanted to confront Helena, demand answers, but knew she was no longer there to explain. All he had left was the silence and the weight of a fatherhood that had been hidden for so many years. Finally, Nicholas decided he needed to visit Helena's old home. He knew that the house in Rosewood Heights had been left to Daniel, and that the young man still kept many of his mother's belongings. A part of Nicholas feared finding something that would confirm his suspicions once and for all, but another part knew he couldn't move forward without those answers. He arrived at Daniel's modest house on a Saturday afternoon, just as the rain had stopped and a fresh breeze swept through the streets of Rosewood Heights. Nicholas parked his car and sat in the seat for a few minutes, looking at the house's facade. It was a simple structure, but there was a certain nostalgic charm in the blue-painted wooden windows and the small garden that Helena had tended with such care. Nicholas took a deep breath before knocking on the door and was greeted by Daniel, who seemed surprised to see him there. "Mr. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting your visit. Is everything all right?" Daniel asked as he opened the door, still unaware of the real reason behind the unexpected visit. "Yes, Daniel, everything's fine." Nicholas hesitated for a moment, looking at the young man before him, whose expression mixed politeness and curiosity. "I was passing by and thought maybe we could talk a bit more. About your mother and what she meant to you." Daniel seemed to suspect the sudden shift in topic but gestured for Nicholas to come in, inviting him to sit in the small living room. The house was cozy, filled with memories of Helena, photos on the shelves, small objects that reflected her careful and determined personality. While Daniel prepared coffee in the kitchen, Nicholas noticed a stack of old photo albums in a corner. He moved closer and, almost without realizing it, opened one of the albums. Inside, he found images of Helena holding a baby, the same baby he now believed to be his son. Nicholas's hands trembled as he turned the pages, seeing Helena's smiling face looking down at the little Daniel. When Daniel returned, he found Nicholas holding the album, his expression a mixture of pain and restrained joy. "She was incredible, you know," Daniel began, unaware of Nicholas's emotional state. "She always told me that I was the most important thing in her life. She never spoke much about my father, But I always knew there was more to the story than she wanted to tell me." Nicholas felt a tightening in his chest at those words, but he held back his tears. He knew that it wasn't yet the moment to reveal the truth, but more and more, he felt that this truth couldn't remain hidden for much longer. Daniel had the right to know who he was, and Nicholas needed to prepare himself to face the consequences of that revelation. As he left Daniel's house that night, the Velmor sky was filled with stars, but Nicholas's heart was in turmoil. He knew that the journey that had brought him this far was far from over, and that the next steps would be decisive for both their futures. In the days following his visit to Daniel's house, Nicholas felt a growing restlessness within him, as if each passing minute increased the urgency to tell the truth. The discovery that he might be Daniel's father, that this young man, full of hopes and lost dreams, was the son he never knew he had become an obsession that consumed his thoughts. But with this obsession, fears also emerged. Nicholas wondered if Daniel would accept him, or if he would see him as nothing more than a man who abandoned his mother at a crucial moment, even without knowing the circumstances. What would Daniel say when he found out that the man who had been offering support was, in fact, the father he had always wished to know? There was so much pain wrapped up in this story, and Nicholas didn't know how to fill the void of so many years of absence. One evening, he decided that he needed to speak to someone who could help him find clarity. And so he sought out Rachel, an old friend who had been his trusted advisor during difficult times. She owned a small cafe in Rosewood Heights, a quiet place where Nicholas would often go in search of a refuge for his thoughts. Upon entering the cafe, Nicholas found Rachel behind the counter, arranging cups and plates. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but quickly noticed the tense expression on her old friend's face. "Nicholas, it's been a while since you came by. Is everything all right?" she asked, inviting him to sit at a table in the back. Nicholas sighed, sitting down with an air of exhaustion and anxiety. He observed Rachel for a moment, as if searching for the right words to describe the confusion that dominated his mind. "Rachel, I discovered something that has completely changed the way I see things. And I don't know how to deal with it," he began, while she served him a cup of hot tea. Rachel sat down across from him, sensing that this was a serious matter. She had always been a good listener, and Nicholas knew he could trust her with his secrets. "Whatever it is, you know I'm here to help. Tell me what happened," Rachel encouraged, placing a comforting hand on his. Nicholas took a deep breath before starting to speak. He told Rachel about his past with Helena, about the relationship they had years ago, and how he had recently discovered that she had a child. As he poured out his thoughts, his eyes grew misty and his voice trembled, especially when he spoke about the possibility that Daniel was his son. Rachel listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Nicholas finished speaking, she squeezed his hand in a gesture of understanding. "This is a major revelation, Nicholas. I can only imagine how much this must be weighing on you. But have you considered that maybe this truth isn't just a burden, but also a chance to connect with Daniel in a way you never imagined?" she said with a gentle look, trying to offer a bit of hope. Nicholas looked down at the steaming tea in front of him, his hands trembling slightly around the cup. "What if he rejects me, Rachel? What if he blames me for never being there? I don't know if I'm ready to face that possibility," he confessed, his voice breaking. Rachel thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I know you're scared, but the truth is always better than silence, Nicholas. And you need to give Daniel the chance to decide for himself. Maybe he'll react with anger, maybe he'll need time, but I believe he deserves to know who you really are. And if you never try, you'll carry that regret for the rest of your life," Rachel said firmly, looking Nicholas in the eyes. Nicholas knew she was right. The truth, however painful, needed to be told. But he also understood that timing was crucial. He couldn't just show up and dump the whole truth on Daniel without preparing the ground. He needed to find a way to create space for this revelation, a way to show Daniel that, even without knowing of his existence before, he was willing to be present now. That night, Nicholas returned home feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. He began organizing his thoughts and decided that he needed to take one more step before revealing everything to Daniel. And this step involved visiting a place he had avoided for a long time, the cemetery where Helena was buried. The next day dawned cloudy, and a light drizzle covered the city of Velmor when Nicholas arrived at the cemetery. He walked along the quiet paths until he found Helena's headstone, simple and unassuming, her name engraved in delicate letters. "Helena," he whispered, kneeling in front of the headstone, tears finally breaking through the barrier he had kept up until then. I didn't know you had a child, that he might be my son." Nicholas spent a few minutes there in silence, as if waiting for the cold wind to bring some kind of answer, some comfort. He realized that, in a way, he was asking Helena for forgiveness and searching for a way to honor her memory by getting closer to Daniel. When he stood up, he felt that something had changed inside him, a lightness that came from the certainty that he was ready to move forward. Now, Nicholas had made a decision. He would find a moment to finally talk to Daniel about what he had discovered. But he knew that before doing so, he needed to find the right words and the way to reveal the truth without causing even more pain. As he walked back to his car, the drizzle turning into a light rain, Nicholas felt that he was nearing a turning point. And although fear was still present, there was also hope that, by telling the truth, he and Daniel might find a path to redemption and, perhaps, a future as father and son. The day after the cemetery visit, Nicholas woke up with a sense of urgency that he couldn't ignore. It was as if every fiber of his being knew that this was the day he needed to face the truth head-on. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, noticing the marks of sleepless nights and the weight of the responsibility he carried. But there was also something new in his gaze, a determination he hadn't felt in years. Determined, he picked up the phone and called Daniel, inviting him to meet at the same cafe in Rosewood Heights where they had met before. Daniel's voice on the other end of the line sounded surprised, but he accepted the invitation. Nicholas knew that this conversation couldn't happen in a public place, but the cafe had a welcoming atmosphere, and he wanted Daniel to feel comfortable to react in any way he needed. The sky was gray, with low clouds covering Velmor, when Nicholas arrived at the cafe. Rachel, who was behind the counter, noticed the tension on his face and offered him an encouraging smile but didn't ask any questions. She knew that the conversation he was about to have was far too delicate for any interference. Nicholas settled into a table at the back and waited. Each minute seemed to drag on, and he felt his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally saw Daniel enter the cafe, he stood up, trying to hide his nervousness. Daniel approached with a polite smile, but there was a hint of curiosity and concern in his expression. "Thank you for coming, Daniel. But I need to talk to you about something important," Nicholas said as Daniel took a seat across from him. Daniel frowned, sensing the seriousness in Nicholas's words. He nodded and waited for the man to begin speaking, feeling that there was something deeper there than just a business conversation or the assistance Nicholas had been offering. Nicholas took a deep breath before starting, trying to organize the thoughts in his mind. He knew there was no easy way to reveal what he had discovered, but he needed to be honest. "Daniel, recently I've been looking into your mother, Helena, and her past. And during this investigation, I discovered some things that left me shaken," he began, keeping his gaze fixed on Daniel's eyes. "The truth is, I knew your mother many years ago, before you were born. We had a relationship, and she never told me that she was pregnant." Daniel's eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief. He stared at Nicholas, trying to absorb what was being said. What are you trying to say?" he asked, his voice coming out quieter than he intended, almost as if he feared the answer. Nicholas felt his throat go dry, but he knew he had to continue. "Daniel, when I started connecting the dates, I realized that the time when your mother and I met matches exactly with when she got pregnant. And that led me to a conclusion that I wasn't ready to accept at first." He hesitated, but forced the words out. "There's a very strong chance that I am your biological father." The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. Daniel blinked a few times, as if expecting the information to dissolve into the air, hoping it was a mistake. He felt the ground shake beneath him, a mixture of anger, confusion, and disbelief taking over his mind. "This is a joke, right? You've got to be kidding me," Daniel exclaimed, his voice now laden with an emotion that Nicholas knew he would have to face. "You're saying that all these years, you were out there while my mother and I went through everything alone? That you're the father I never knew?" Nicholas swallowed hard, feeling each of Daniel's words cut through him like a knife. He wanted to explain, to justify his absence, but he knew that any words would sound like empty excuses to Daniel right now. "I didn't know, Daniel. I swear, I didn't know about your existence until I started digging deeper. If I had known, things would have been different," Nicholas said, his voice filled with genuine pain. "But I understand if you need time. I understand if you hate me for not being there. I just wanted you to know the truth." Daniel suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the cafe floor. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to find focus amidst the storm of emotions overtaking him. He looked at Nicholas with a mix of anger and tears in his eyes, as if the presence of this man was a reminder of everything he had lost. "I don't know what to do with this, Nicholas. I don't know what you expect from me now. You think you can just show up and say you're my father, and everything's going to be okay?" Daniel's voice shook, and he turned, heading for the door before Nicholas could respond. Nicholas watched in silence as Daniel walked out of the cafe, feeling his heart break with each step the young man took. He knew this wouldn't be easy, that maybe Daniel would never accept the truth or forgive him for his unintentional absence. But at the same time, he felt that he had done what needed to be done, revealed the truth, exposed his vulnerabilities, and opened a door that it was now up to Daniel to decide whether to cross. Rachel, who had been watching from a distance, slowly approached and placed a comforting hand on Nicholas's shoulder, offering silent support. He looked at her, tears brimming in his eyes, and smiled sadly. "I guess now, Rachel, all I can do is wait," he said with a deep sigh, "and hope that somehow he finds room in his heart to understand what happened." Rachel nodded, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Sometimes the truth needs time to settle, Nicholas. But you did the right thing, and that's already a big step." Nicholas left the cafe that day with a sense of relief mixed with deep pain. He knew that the journey was far from over, but he also knew that he couldn't turn back now. Now, it was a matter of waiting and hoping that, in time, Daniel would be ready to face him again and perhaps give this relationship a chance to grow. After the revelation at the cafe, Daniel spent the following days in a whirlwind of emotions. The world he knew seemed to have turned upside down. He walked the streets of Rosewood Heights like a ghost, feeling the weight of a truth he had never imagined existed. Nicholas's words echoed in his mind at every moment, "I am your father." Back in his small apartment, Daniel sat on the couch, holding an old photo of his mother, Helena. Memories of his childhood flooded back. The moments when he asked about his father, and she always averted her gaze, changing the subject with a sad smile. Now, he began to understand why. But this understanding brought more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Nicholas also felt the burden of the revelation. He began to worry about Daniel's well-being, but he knew he couldn't force a reconciliation. In his luxurious apartment, he found himself staring at his phone, wishing for a message or a call from the young man. But the days went by, and Daniel's response was silence. He knew he had to respect the young man's time, but the uncertainty of how their relationship would develop gnawed at him from within. On a cold autumn night, Nicholas decided to visit Helena's grave, something he had been putting off since his discovery. He walked slowly through the cemetery until he found the white marble tombstone with her name engraved on it. As he looked at the letters that formed the name of the woman he had loved so many years ago, a wave of longing and regret washed over him. "Helena," he whispered, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes. "I wish you were here to tell me what to do now. I feel like I've failed both of you, even without knowing he existed." Nicholas knelt beside the grave, letting the tears flow freely. He felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The cold breeze cut through the night, but he stayed there for hours, seeking some comfort in the silent presence of the woman who had once been part of his life. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to drown his confusion in work. He threw himself into his projects, trying to keep his mind busy and push away thoughts of Nicholas. But even so, the image of Nicholas's emotional face at the cafe and the words he had spoken continued to haunt him. In an attempt to escape himself, Daniel began to stay later at work, avoiding returning home to face the emptiness he felt. One evening, after another exhausting day, he found himself sitting in a bar in Rosewood Heights, nursing a beer as he stared absently at the city lights. The noise around him was comforting, a welcome contrast to the silence of his own thoughts. Then his phone vibrated, revealing a text message from Rachel, the cafe waitress. "I know all of this must be really hard, Daniel. But sometimes, the truth hurts before it heals. Nicholas seems just as lost as you. I just wanted you to know that, sometimes, giving a chance to understand things can surprise us. If you need to talk, I'm here." Daniel read the message several times, feeling a mixture of anger and gratitude. He didn't want anyone intervening in his confusion, but at the same time, Rachel's concern touched something within him. He put his phone away, frustrated at not having ready answers. He looked at his reflection in the bar window and saw a man he didn't recognize, someone torn between the desire to reject this unexpected past and the need to understand who he really was. That same night, as Nicholas left the cemetery, a decision began to take shape in his mind. He knew Daniel needed space, but he also knew that silence could create an unbridgeable gap between them. He decided that if Daniel didn't want to talk now, he should at least know that Nicholas was willing to fight for this relationship. And to do that, he would have to be honest about everything, not just about paternity, but also about how he felt after discovering his own son so many years later. Nicholas returned to his apartment in Velmor and began to write a letter. Words that he couldn't say in person but hoped might reach Daniel somehow. He wrote about how he had met Helena, how he had never known of his existence, and how much he wished he could turn back time and be part of Daniel's life from the start. Every word was a confession, an apology, and a sincere wish to build something from what remained between them. When he finished the letter, Nicholas folded it carefully and, the next day, left it at Daniel's apartment door. He knew he couldn't expect an immediate response, but it was a gesture of hope, a sign that he was willing to face the consequences of his mistakes and build a new path, no matter how painful it might be. Daniel found the letter that same night when he got home, exhausted and still trying to escape his thoughts. Seeing Nicholas's name on the envelope, his first instinct was to ignore it, but something made him open it and start reading. As Nicholas's words unfolded before his eyes, he felt tears well up, each sentence touching a wound he had tried to ignore. At the end of the letter, one sentence lingered in his mind. "I know it may be too late, but if there's any chance we can start over, I'm here, willing to try." Daniel didn't know if he was ready to respond to this offer. He didn't know if he wanted a father after so many years of living without one. But for the first time, he felt that maybe he wasn't as alone as he had imagined. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. Nicholas's letter was on the table, carefully folded, but the words kept echoing in his mind. He spent hours rereading each line, feeling the sincerity and vulnerability Nicholas had poured into it. It was a side of the millionaire he never imagined he would see. And though the pain and confusion were still intense, there was something in those words that seemed to call for a response. He knew he wouldn't be able to focus on work until he resolved this turmoil within himself. Determined to face the situation, Daniel grabbed his coat and left his apartment, heading for the luxurious building where Nicholas lived. On the way, conflicting thoughts assailed him. Part of him wanted answers, wanted to understand what exactly Nicholas expected from him. Another part just wanted to shout about all the lost opportunities and the absence he had felt his entire life. When he reached the entrance of the building, he hesitated for a moment, looking at the imposing glass and marble facade. He took a deep breath and walked through the doors, asking the doorman for Nicholas. He was directed to Nicholas's apartment, riding up in a silent elevator that seemed to amplify the tension he felt. Nicholas, not expecting a visit so soon, was surprised when he opened the door to see Daniel standing there, holding the letter. Daniel's face was serious, but there was a restrained emotion in his eyes that Nicholas couldn't quite decipher. "May I come in?" Daniel asked, his voice calmer than he had imagined it would be. Nicholas nodded and stepped aside to let his son enter. The apartment's interior was impeccably decorated, but the tension in the air seemed to fill every corner of the room. Daniel looked around, taking in the place where Nicholas lived, a stark contrast to his own simpler life. But there, in that luxurious space, both seemed equally fragile. "I read your letter," Daniel began, sitting down on the sofa, holding the letter between his fingers. "And honestly, I still don't know how to feel about all this." Nicholas sat across from him, an expression of anticipation and fear subtly etched into his features. "I understand," Nicholas replied, trying to stay calm. "I know it's a lot to process. And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, or to accept this situation without question." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've spent my whole life without a father. And now you show up and say you're my father. I don't even know what that means for me, for my life." He opened his eyes, looking directly at Nicholas. "I don't want a relationship built on obligation, on guilt for something you didn't even know. If we're going to try something, I need to feel that it's genuine." Nicholas leaned forward, his eyes searching Daniel's, hoping he would see the sincerity in his words. "I don't know how to do this either, Daniel. I'm learning every day. But I want to try, really. I want to get to know you, to learn about your life, about who you are. And I want you to know the side of me that isn't in the newspapers or business magazines." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want you to see me as just the man who showed up too late." The silence that followed was intense. Daniel looked away for a moment, trying to maintain his composure, but Nicholas's words hit him deeply. So much was unspoken, so many layers of feelings built up over the years, and he found himself facing the choice of opening up to something new or continuing to live with the same unanswered questions. After a few moments, Daniel finally spoke. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but I'm willing to try. Maybe we can start with small things, simple conversations, no expectations beyond just getting to know each other." Nicholas could barely contain the sigh of relief that escaped his lips. He nodded several times, as if Daniel's words were the lifeline he had been hoping for. "That's more than I could ask for, Daniel. I promise I won't push. We'll go at your pace, and I'll be here, whenever you want to talk." They sat in silence for a few minutes, but this time, the silence was more comfortable, less burdened with uncertainties. It was the beginning of an effort, a mutual attempt to turn this unexpected connection into something that might make sense for both of them. Before getting up to leave, Daniel looked out the window, seeing the lights of Velmor reflected on the distant buildings. A city full of stories, of lives intersecting at every corner. And now, he felt that his own story was taking an unexpected turn, a new chapter he never thought he'd be willing to write. When Daniel finally left the apartment, Nicholas stood there, watching his son walk down the hallway. He knew there was still a long road ahead, full of challenges and difficulties. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine sense of hope. The fear and pain were still present, but there was also the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to become something more than just strangers brought together by chance. As he closed the apartment door, Nicholas whispered to himself, with a faint smile on his lips, "Thank you, Helena. Maybe this is the beginning of something good." In the days that followed their meeting, Nicholas and Daniel began to meet more regularly, always in neutral spaces. They chose cafes in Rosewood Heights and walks in nearby parks, away from curious eyes and work environments that might pressure them to be something they weren't ready to be. Each meeting was a cautious step into the unknown, like exploring new terrain without a map to guide them. During these initial conversations, Nicholas tried to understand Daniel's world. He asked about his interests, childhood memories, and the challenges he had faced over the years. Daniel, still a bit hesitant, responded carefully, weighing each word. He spoke about how he was raised by his mother, Helena, and how she always encouraged him to be independent, to seek out his own opportunities even when circumstances were tough. One afternoon, while they walked through a wooded area in Rosewood Heights, Daniel shared a memory that had left a deep mark on him. "My mom, she always told me I should find my own way, that I didn't need anyone to tell me who I was. I think that's why I never felt the lack of a father so directly." He paused, looking at the birds flying around. "But that doesn't mean I never wondered what it would be like if I ever found out who he was." Nicholas listened intently, feeling a quiet pain as he heard how strong Helena had been to raise Daniel on her own. He wanted to know more about her, about the woman he had once loved and who had left him with a part of himself. But he knew Daniel wasn't ready to open up completely, and he respected his pace. "Your mother was an admirable woman, from what you've told me," Nicholas said, trying to keep his tone light but full of respect. "And I'm sure she'd be proud of the man you've become." Daniel smiled, but it was a melancholy smile, full of longing for Helena. He said nothing, just continued walking beside Nicholas, each lost in their own thoughts. Although there was still a barrier between them, Nicholas felt that, little by little, he was learning to understand his son. Their meetings began to extend further. Nicholas brought Daniel into more of his own routine, opening the doors of his life that had previously been surrounded by luxury and distance. One afternoon, Nicholas invited Daniel to his office at Horizon Systems, showing him a side that few knew: the hard work, the endless meetings, and the tough decisions he had to make every day. Daniel, in turn, began to see Nicholas from a new perspective. He realized that, despite the power and wealth, his father also bore the weight of responsibilities and expectations. It was easy to judge him as someone distant and disconnected from the world's realities, but as he learned more about the challenges Nicholas faced, Daniel began to see a humanity in him that he hadn't expected to find. During one of those visits, as Nicholas explained an expansion project for a new sector of the company, Daniel watched him from the side, intrigued by the dedication he showed. "You know, I always thought guys like you only cared about numbers, charts, and stuff I'd never understand," Daniel admitted with a half-smile. "But you actually seem to care about the people who work for you." Nicholas let out a low chuckle, but there was a sincerity in his gaze that made Daniel realize he wasn't hiding. "I've learned that a company is only as strong as the people who make it up. And in the past few months, that's become clearer to me than ever." Nicholas paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's how I see our relationship, Daniel. It doesn't matter what others say or expect of us. What matters is how we build this, with patience and dedication, like anything that's worth it." Daniel remained silent for a moment, reflecting on those words. He wasn't ready to fully agree, but he couldn't deny that they were starting to make sense to him. Maybe, just maybe, there was room to build something new, different from everything he had known before. As the two of them worked to navigate this new dynamic, Nicholas also made an effort to get to know Daniel's friends, trying to understand the environment in which he lived and worked. On one occasion, Nicholas was invited by Daniel to a simple dinner with some close friends, and the contrast between their worlds became even more evident. However, Nicholas made an effort to adapt, laughing at the jokes and listening intently to the stories of these young people who lived such a different life from his own. In the middle of the dinner, one of Daniel's friends, a witty man named Sam, made a comment that left everyone at the table laughing. "Daniel, your dad's got more style than all of us combined. I used to think millionaires were all serious and boring, but he even knows how to crack a joke." The table erupted in laughter, and Nicholas, though a bit taken aback, felt more at ease than he had expected. It was a new feeling, being in a space where he wasn't just Mr. Whitmore, but someone learning to connect with a son he barely knew. As he drove back home that night, Nicholas realized that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about reports or business meetings. He was thinking about Daniel, about how he had managed to overcome so many challenges on his own, and about how he might try to be a positive presence in his life from now on. But he also knew that the tougher questions were yet to come. He knew that the initial closeness was only a part of the process, and that, sooner or later, they would have to confront the wounds that had yet to be exposed. Nicholas dreaded the moment when Daniel would directly confront him about his absence, about everything he might have been if he had a father by his side. But he was willing to face it, because he was beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, what he had found in Daniel was more important than anything else he possessed. And so, the days passed, each one bringing new challenges but also new possibilities. The relationship between father and son was still fragile, full of uncertainties, but it was real, tangible, something they could both touch and shape, like new ground where they were beginning to plant their hopes. The days moved at a steady pace, but the growing connection between Nicholas and Daniel brought out emotions that both struggled to control. They had learned to coexist and even to appreciate each other's company, but unresolved issues still lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. And the moment Nicholas had feared finally came on a rainy autumn night, when Daniel asked to meet him at the old park where they used to talk. Nicholas arrived at the park, sheltered under an umbrella, watching the raindrops ripple across the artificial lakes. The lights of Velmor reflected in the puddles, creating a scene that resembled a shattered mirror of the sky. He spotted Daniel in the distance, standing under a tree, staring at the ground as if searching for the courage to face what was coming. "Daniel," Nicholas called out, his voice gentle but anxious. "You wanted to talk to me?" Daniel lifted his head slowly, and his eyes showed a mix of pain and determination. There was something different in his gaze, a depth that Nicholas hadn't seen before. He knew that his son was ready to face the questions that had surrounded them since the truth about his origins had surfaced. "I've been thinking, Nicholas, about all of this. About us. About my mother." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Did you know that she never told me who my father was? That she chose for me to grow up without that part of my story?" Nicholas felt a pang in his chest. He knew this was the moment of greatest vulnerability, when everything that had been kept silent would finally come to light. "I know she did it because she wanted to protect me," Daniel continued, his voice gaining a note of frustration that he could no longer hold back. "But now I can't stop thinking, where were you, Nicholas? Where were you when I needed a father, when she needed someone to help her? Why did you never show up?" Nicholas felt the impact of those words like a blow directly to his soul. He knew Daniel had every right to ask, to demand answers that he himself was still struggling to understand. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer to Daniel, stopping beside him as the rain fell around them. "I have no excuses for what happened, Daniel," Nicholas said, his voice choked with the guilt he had carried for weeks. "I didn't know that Helena was pregnant, that she had you. When we parted ways, I thought it was over, that our lives would follow separate paths. But now I realize how blind I was. I should have looked for her, I should have insisted. And for that I'm truly sorry." Daniel turned to him, and for the first time, Nicholas saw tears mingling with the rain on his face. It was a painful sight, but one full of an honesty he knew he needed to face. "My mom never said a bad word about you, never. But I always wondered what it would be like if you had shown up one day." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, as if he were fighting against his own feelings. "I thought I could handle it, that it didn't matter to me, but here we are. And all I can feel is anger for everything that could have been different." Nicholas took a step toward Daniel, trying to reach the son who, in that moment, seemed both so close and so distant. "I can't change the past, Daniel. I can't erase the years that have gone by, but I can be here now, and from this moment on." Nicholas paused, trying to find the right words. "I understand that you need time to accept this, to forgive. I just want you to know that I'm willing to face anything to build a future with you, if you'll let me." There was a moment of silence between them, with only the sound of the rain filling the air around them. Daniel looked at Nicholas, his eyes filled with hurt, but also with something that resembled hope. "I don't know how to forgive, Nicholas," Daniel murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. "But maybe I'm willing to try." And with those words, they stood there, under the rain, knowing that this conversation was just the beginning of a long process of healing. Daniel knew it wouldn't be easy to forget the years he grew up without a father, but he was willing to give a chance to the man who stood beside him, trying to make up for lost time. And Nicholas, for his part, felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, as if he finally had the chance to make amends for a mistake he didn't even know he had made. The days that followed were a mix of efforts and setbacks, but now there was a new honesty between them. Daniel allowed himself to open up more about his childhood memories, about the loss of Helena, and the moments when he missed having a father the most. And Nicholas listened to every word with the attention of someone who knew that each detail was essential to understanding his son. Nicholas also shared stories from his own past, about how his life had been shaped by difficult decisions, and how he always thought he could control everything with discipline and focus. But now, he realized that the most important things couldn't be controlled, only embraced and lived with honesty. At the end of one of those conversations, Daniel finally looked at Nicholas in a way he never had before. A look that carried a forgiveness in progress, but one that already hinted at a path towards something better. "I don't know where this will lead, Nicholas, but I want to find out," Daniel said, and for the first time, his tone held a note of hope. Nicholas felt a knot unravel in his chest and smiled at Daniel, not as a millionaire or a businessman, but as a father who was finally finding his place beside his son. "So do I, Daniel. So do I." And so, father and son began a new chapter in their lives, knowing that there were still challenges ahead but trusting that together, they could build something real. The lights of Velmor, shining in the distance, now seemed closer, like a beacon guiding them toward a future full of possibilities. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and explore the connections between this and other tales in Velmor. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments.